Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Jolly, and today we're diving deep into the extraordinary life of someone who, might just be the most fascinating American who ever lived. Yep, we're talking about the man himself, Benjamin Franklin. And wow, by the end of this podcast, you'll understand why this guy wasn't just a founding father, but a walking, talking embodiment of the American dream before America even knew what that dream was. When you see Benjamin Franklin on the $100 bill, you're looking at probably America's first celebrity, its first international superstar, and arguably its most accomplished human. We're talking about a man who went from making soap and candles and working the printing presses to dining with kings, from a teenage runaway to one of the most respected diplomats in the world. Franklin didn't just live the American dream. He invented it. So buckle up, because Franklin's story reads like something out of a novel, except that it's all true. Well, maybe except for some of that lightning, kite, and key story. Most of that isn't true. Let's start at the very beginning. Benjamin Franklin burst into the world on January 17, 1706, on Milk Street in Boston, Massachusetts. He grew up in a tiny house in colonial Boston, cramped and chaotic, because Ben was the 15th of 17 children. 17. I mean, can you imagine the dinner table? Well, his father could, and his father's name was Josiah Franklin, and he made soap and candles for a living. Honest work, but certainly not glamorous. Now here's where Franklin's story starts to get interesting. His mother came from fascinating stock. Her father, Peter Folger, was what we'd call a troublemaker today. He was a court clerk who ended up in jail for over a year because he couldn't pay bail. He was described as sort of a rebel destined to transform colonial America. So rebellion? Well, this was literally in Franklin's DNA. Young Ben showed signs of brilliance early on. As a kid growing up along the Charles River, he was described as generally the leader among the boys. But here's the thing about colonial America. Being brilliant did not guarantee you an education if your family couldn't afford it. Franklin's father wanted to send Ben to school to become a minister, but after just 2 years at Boston Latin School, the money ran out. So, at age 10, Benjamin Franklin's formal education was over. But Franklin, he never let a little thing like the end of school stop him from learning. He became a voracious reader, teaching himself everything he could get his hands on. This self-education would become a hallmark of his entire life. Franklin never stopped learning, never stopped growing, never stopped pushing himself to become more than what circumstances said he could be. At the age of 12, Franklin was apprenticed to his older brother James, who ran a printing shop. Now, this is where we see the birth of Benjamin Franklin that we know. James, though, wasn't exactly the world's kindest boss. He treated Ben, pretty harshly, almost like a servant than a brother. And Franklin, even as a teenager, had zero tolerance for unfair treatment. And this is where things get, again, really interesting. When Franklin was 15, his brother James founded the New England Courant, the third newspaper in Boston. Ben wanted to write for the paper, but James refused to let his little brother contribute. So what did Franklin do? Well, he created an alter ego. Meet Silence Dogood, supposedly a middle-aged widow with strong opinions about everything happening in Boston. Franklin would slip these letters under the printing shop door at night, and they became the talk of the town. People loved Silence Dogood's wit, her intelligence, her observations about society. Nobody knew that the popular correspondent was actually a 16-year-old male apprentice. When James finally discovered that his little brother was the famous Silence Dogood, he was furious. But Franklin had tasted freedom, creative freedom, intellectual freedom, the freedom to speak his mind. When James was jailed for 3 weeks in 1722 for publishing material that criticized the governor, well, Franklin took over the newspaper. And what did he do? Well, he published a quote from Cato's letters. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. At 17 years old, Franklin was already a champion of free speech and free thought. But he wasn't done rebelling just yet. In 1723, at age 17, he broke his apprenticeship contract, which was basically illegal, and ran away to Philadelphia. He was then a teenage runaway with barely any money, walking through the streets of Philadelphia, buying 3 large bread rolls because, well, that's all he could afford. He was carrying 2 of them and eating the third when he walked past the house of a girl named Deborah Reed, who would later become his wife. She watched this ridiculous-looking boy parade past with his arms full of bread and had no idea she was looking at her future husband and one of America's greatest figures. But Franklin didn't just survive in Philadelphia. Oh no, he thrived. The guy had this incredible ability to reinvent himself, to adapt, to make himself indispensable wherever he went. He worked in several different printing shops, but the real adventure came when Pennsylvania's governor, Sir William Keith, convinced him to go to London to buy equipment for starting a newspaper. Here's where we see both Franklin's trusting nature and his ability to bounce back from setbacks. When he got to London, he discovered that Governor Keith's promises were worthless. There was no backing for a newspaper, no financial support, nothing. Franklin was stranded in London at age 18 with no money and no prospects. But did he panic? Did he give up? Absolutely not. Franklin got a job as a typesetter in a London printing shop and spent nearly 2 years learning practically everything he could about the printing trade, about London society, and about the wider world. When he finally returned to Philadelphia in 1726, he came back stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. Back in Philadelphia, Franklin didn't just restart his career. He revolutionized it. In 1728, he set up his own printing house, and the following year he took over the Pennsylvania Gazette. This wasn't just any newspaper. Franklin turned it into the most influential publication in the colonies. He used it as a platform for his wit, his political observations, his social commentary. Franklin understood something that most people didn't: the power of the press to shape public opinion. But the real genius move came in 1732 when Franklin began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac under the pseudonym Richard Saunders. This little publication made Franklin wealthy and famous throughout the colonies. Poor Richard's Almanac was packed with weather predictions, astronomical data, and most famously, Franklin's witty sayings that are still quoted today. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. Fish and visitors stink in 3 days. These weren't just clever sayings, they were a philosophy of life that emphasized hard work, frugality, self-improvement, and common sense. Franklin was essentially creating the American work ethic, one aphorism at a time. The almanac sold about 10,000 copies per year, and it became an institution. People planned their lives around Poor Richard's predictions and lived by its wisdom. Franklin had created America's first self-help empire, and he did it all the while maintaining the fiction that he wasn't actually the author. Now, while Franklin was building his publishing empire, he was also becoming a civic leader. This guy didn't just succeed for himself, he wanted to improve society for everyone. In 1727, at the age of 21, he formed the Junto, a discussion group of ambitious young men who met weekly to debate issues, share knowledge, and figure out how to improve their community. The Junto was modeled after the coffee houses that Franklin had seen in London, but it was uniquely American in its practical focus. These guys just didn't talk, well, they acted. They created Philadelphia's first library, the Library Company of Philadelphia, because books were rare and expensive. If they pooled their resources, everybody could read everything. But Franklin was just getting started. He helped found Philadelphia's first fire department, the Union Fire Company, because he realized that fires were a constant threat in a city full of wooden buildings. He established Pennsylvania's hospital, the first hospital in the colonies. He created the first homeowners insurance company. He even organized the city's first militia when war threatened. Franklin understood something fundamental about American society. Voluntary associations could accomplish what government couldn't or wouldn't do. He was creating the template for American civic engagement, showing that ordinary citizens could band together to solve problems and improve their communities. But perhaps Franklin's most famous achievement was in science, particularly his groundbreaking work with electricity. In the 1740s, electricity was a mysterious force that scientists barely understood. Franklin proposed that there was only one type of electrical fluid, but it could exist under different pressures. He was the first person to label electrical charges as positive and negative, terms that we still use today. He discovered the principle of conservation of charge. In 1748, he built a multi-plate capacitor that he called an electrical battery. And then came the famous kite experiment. Now, it's fair to say that this story has certainly expanded over the centuries, and I think it's fair to say it's now more myth than, well, truth. But we shouldn't ever let truth get in the way of a good story. Okay, let's go back to 1752 in Philadelphia. Dark storm clouds roll in as Benjamin Franklin grabs his homemade kite and heads outside. Rain pours down as he launches the kite high into the sky. Suddenly, crack! Lightning strikes the kite directly. Electricity surges down the wet string to the metal key tied at the bottom. Sparks fly as Franklin touches the key, discovering that lightning equals electricity. This brave founding father risks his life for science, proving once and for all that lightning is electrical. It's dramatic, heroic, and shows American ingenuity, conquering nature's mysteries through bold experimentation. And it's not true. Here's what actually happened, or at least what we think happened. Now, if Franklin had been struck by lightning, he'd be dead, and we would likely have no constitution, at least as we know it. And honestly, we may not have a country as we know it. The truth is that Franklin probably did fly a kite during a storm, but lightning never struck it directly. Instead, the stormy atmosphere charged the kite with ambient electricity. When he touched the key, small sparks proved atmospheric and laboratory electricity were identical. Franklin's work with electricity earned him the Royal Society's prestigious Copley Medal in 1753, and in 1756, he became one of the few 18th century Americans elected as a Fellow of the Society. European scientists couldn't believe that some guy from the American colonies had made such groundbreaking discoveries. But Franklin's scientific interests went far beyond electricity. He studied ocean currents and was the first person to chart and name the Gulf Stream. While serving as deputy postmaster, he noticed that British mail ships took much longer to reach New York than merchant ships took to reach Newport, Rhode Island. When he investigated, he discovered that merchant ships avoided a strong eastbound current, while mail ships sailed right into it. Franklin worked with his cousin, Timothy Folger, a whaling captain, to map this current. His Gulf Stream chart, published in 1770, could have saved the British ships 2 weeks of sailing time, but it was completely ignored back in England. It wasn't until 1980 that Franklin's original chart was rediscovered in a Paris library, making front-page news in the New York Times. Franklin also made important observations about refrigeration, discovering the cooling effect of evaporation. He and fellow scientist John Hadley conducted experiments with ether and a mercury thermometer, eventually reaching a temperature of 7 degrees Fahrenheit on a 65-degree Fahrenheit day. He studied the relationship between color and heat absorption, conducting experiments with colored cloth in the snow to prove that darker colors absorb more heat. He made observations about meteorology, noticing that storms don't always travel in the direction of prevailing winds. After the volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783, Franklin was one of the first to connect volcanic activity with climate changes. As Franklin's reputation as a scientist grew, so did his involvement in politics. In the 1750s, he was appointed Deputy Postmaster General for British North America, responsible for mail service from Pennsylvania to Newfoundland. Franklin revolutionized the postal system, improving efficiency and achieving the first profits for the colonial post office. In 1754, he headed Pennsylvania's delegation to the Albany Congress, where he proposed a plan of union for the colonies. While the plan was not adopted, elements of it found their way into the Articles of Confederation and later, the Constitution. Franklin was already thinking about American unity decades before the Revolution. But it was Franklin's role as a colonial agent in England that really shaped his political career. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly sent him to England to protest the political influence of the Penn family, who controlled Pennsylvania. Franklin spent 5 years in London, living on Craven Street just off of the Strand, developing close relationships and becoming deeply involved in British intellectual and political circles. Initially, Franklin considered himself a loyal British subject who wanted to improve relations between Britain and the colonies. He belonged to a club of radical Whigs, associating with influential thinkers and politicians. He received honorary degrees from St. Andrews and Oxford, earning the title Dr. Franklin that he would carry for the rest of his life. But Franklin's relationship with Britain began to sour as British policies toward the colonies became increasingly oppressive. In 1765, he opposed the Stamp Act, though he initially made the political mistake of recommending a friend for the post of stamp distributor in Pennsylvania. When Pennsylvanians learned of this, they were furious and threatened to destroy his home. Franklin quickly learned from his mistake. He testified before the House of Commons during the proceedings that led to the Stamp Act's repeal, suddenly emerging as the leading spokesman for American interests in England. Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts appointed him as their agent to the Crown. The turning point came in 1772 when Franklin obtained private letters from Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, proving that he had encouraged the Crown to crack down on Bostonians. Franklin sent these letters to America, where they were published and caused, a political firestorm. The British began to regard Franklin as a troublemaker and agitator of rebellion. The final humiliation came on January 29, 1774, when Franklin was systematically ridiculed and humiliated by Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn before the Privy Council. This brilliant man who had been honored throughout Europe was treated like a common criminal, accused of theft and sedition. Franklin stood there in silence, taking the abuse. But inside, he was making a decision that would change American history. When Franklin returned to Philadelphia in March 1775, he had abandoned any hope of reconciliation with Britain. The man who had spent decades trying to improve relations between the colonies and the mother country was now committed to American independence. Franklin arrived in Philadelphia on May 5, 1775, just 2 weeks after the battles of Lexington and Concord that had begun the American Revolution. The Pennsylvania Assembly immediately chose him as their delegate to the Second Continental Congress. At age 69, when most men would be thinking about retirement, Franklin was embarking on the most important phase of his career. In June 1776, Franklin was appointed to the Committee of Five that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Though he was temporarily disabled by gout and could not attend most committee meetings, he made several small but important changes to Thomas Jefferson's draft. When John Hancock remarked at the signing that they must all hang together, Franklin reportedly replied, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or, most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." But Franklin's greatest contribution to the Revolution came as America's diplomat to France. On October 26, 1776, Congress dispatched Franklin to France as commissioner for the United States. He took with him his 16-year-old grandson, William Temple Franklin, and together they sailed into one of the most successful diplomatic missions in American history. Now, Franklin in Paris is one of my favorite parts of this story because this 70-year-old man essentially became the world's first international celebrity. The French were absolutely enchanted by him. Here was this wise, simple American philosopher wearing plain brown clothes instead of fancy European fashion, embodying everything the French philosophies admired about natural virtue and republican simplicity. But here's the brilliant part. Franklin was playing a role. He understood exactly what the French wanted to see, and he gave it to them. He spoke in homespun aphorisms instead of flowery court language, and he presented himself as this exotic American sage. And the French? Well, the French ate it up. Behind this simple exterior, though, Franklin was running one of the most sophisticated diplomatic operations in history. He was charming everyone from King Louis XVI to the brilliant women who ran the intellectual salons of Paris. He was securing massive loans from France, convincing them to provide weapons and supplies, and ultimately persuading them to join the war against Britain. And let's be honest, Franklin was having the time of his life. At 70 years old, he was charming French women half his age, attending glittering parties, playing chess with duchesses, and living it up while saving America. When he played chess with the Duchess of Bourbon and captured her king after she made an illegal move, she protested, "We do not take kings so." Franklin replied, "Well, we do in America." Franklin's diplomatic success was absolutely crucial to American victory. Without French aid, the money, the weapons, the naval support, America probably would have lost the revolution. And all of that came about because this elderly American scientist understood how to charm the French court and play international politics at the highest level. But Franklin's personal life during these years was, well, complicated and sometimes heartbreaking. He had married Deborah Reed in a common law ceremony in 1730, and they had raised his illegitimate son, William, together. They had 2 children, Francis, who died of smallpox at age 4, and Sarah, who became Franklin's beloved daughter, Sally. The tragedy of Franklin's family was his relationship with his son William. William had become the royal governor of New Jersey and remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution. Father and son, who had once been close, found themselves on opposite sides of the war that defined America. William was imprisoned by the revolutionary government, and when he was finally released in a prisoner exchange, he sailed to England and never returned to America. Franklin's letters about William show the pain of this separation. In the peace talks of 1782, when Benjamin Franklin insisted that loyalists who had borne arms against the United States should be excluded from pardons, he was undoubtedly thinking of his own son. The personal had become political in the most painful way possible. Meanwhile, Deborah had died in 1774 while Franklin was in London. Her fear of ocean travel meant she never accompanied Franklin on his missions to Europe, and he did not return for her funeral. Franklin carried the guilt of these separations for the rest of his life. When Franklin finally returned to America in 1785, he occupied a position second only to George Washington as a champion of American independence. He was 79 years old and should have been ready to retire, but America still needed him for one more crucial task. In 1787, Franklin served as Pennsylvania's delegate to the Constitutional Convention. At 81, he was by far the oldest delegate, and his presence lent crucial credibility to the proceedings. While younger men argued and fought over the details of creating a new government, Franklin played the role of wise mediator. When the convention deadlocked over representation in Congress, with small states and large states unable to agree, Franklin supported the Great Compromise that created both the House of Representatives and the Senate. His experience and wisdom helped save the entire convention from completely falling apart. Even more remarkably, Franklin was one of the few founding fathers who spoke out against slavery at the convention. Just months before his death, he petitioned Congress to end slavery, showing that even in his final years, he was still fighting for human rights and progress. When Elizabeth Willing Powell asked Franklin what kind of government they had created, he gave his famous reply, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Even in his moment of triumph, Franklin understood that the real work of democracy was just beginning. Franklin's health had been declining for years. He suffered from obesity, gout, and other ailments that made his final years painful. On April 17, 1790, at the age of 84, Benjamin Franklin died at his home in Philadelphia. His last words were, reportedly, "A dying man can do nothing easy," spoken to his daughter when she suggested he change position to breathe more easily. 20,000 people attended Franklin's funeral, nearly the entire population of Philadelphia. The Constitutional Assembly in revolutionary France entered into mourning for 3 days. America had lost its Renaissance man, and the world knew it. So why was Benjamin Franklin one of the greatest Americans who ever lived? Well, the answer lies not just in what he accomplished, which was plenty, but in what he represented. Franklin embodied the American spirit of self-improvement, innovation, and reinvention. He proved that in America, it doesn't matter where you start. What matters is how far you're willing to go. Franklin was a self-made man who rose from poverty to international fame through pure intelligence and hard work. He was a scientist who unlocked the mysteries of electricity and natural philosophy. He was a writer whose wit and wisdom still makes us think today. He was an inventor who created everything from lightning rods to bifocals to more efficient stoves. He was a diplomat who saved the American Revolution. But most importantly, Franklin was a builder of institutions, of communities, of the American Republic itself. He showed us that one person really can change the world, but only if they're willing to work with others, to compromise when necessary, and to never stop learning and growing. Franklin was the first American because he invented what it meant to be American. He showed us that democracy requires active citizens, that science and reason can improve human life, that diversity and debate make us stronger, and that a sense of humor can get you through, well, just about anything. In our polarized times, we could all learn from Franklin's example. He understood that building a great society requires both individual excellence and collective effort. He knew that democracy is messy and difficult, but also it's worth fighting for. He believed in human potential while never losing sight of human limitations. Benjamin Franklin lived 84 extraordinary years, and every one of them was spent pushing the boundaries of what one person could accomplish. He was America's greatest Renaissance man, and his legacy reminds us that the American experiment is still ongoing, and that each of us has a role to play in making it succeed.